imagine the first returns will take place?
Well, the first detentions we want to take place in a matter of days,
Right.
and then we will be referring those cases immediately to France. There are then...
Recently.
This is not something that we put forward, and we've also always been clear that the important things for the UK is we do not have a return to free movement, and we also always need to make sure that net migration comes down.
Channel crisis, Britain's high-stakes gamble with France. Right? Let's get straight to it, shall we? If you're not already subscribed to UK Connors, do yourself a favor and hit that button now, because what we're about to discuss will fundamentally change how you understand Britain's immigration crisis. The political chess match unfolding between Westminster and the LSE Palace isn't just another diplomatic dance. It's a desperate gamble that could either solve one of Britain's most pressing challenges or spectacularly backfire in ways that will haunt both nations for decades. Picture this. French police officers, abandoning decades of maritime protocol, deliberately puncturing dinghies with knives as desperate asylum seekers cling to sinking vessels in the frigid waters off Boulogne. It sounds like something from a dystopian thriller, doesn't it? Yet this is precisely what happened last Friday, marking a seismic shift in how France approaches a Channel crossing crisis. The question isn't whether this represents progress or barbarism. It's whether Britain can stomach the moral implications of what it's asking France to do on its behalf. Yvette Cooper's weekend statement praising French innovative approaches carries the diplomatic weight of a government walking a tightrope between public pressure and humanitarian reality. When the Home Secretary described collaboration with France as vital to stop boats crossing in the first place, she's essentially admitting that Britain's sovereignty over its own borders depends entirely on French cooperation. That's not just politically awkward, it's constitutionally humiliating for a nation that spent 3 years arguing Brexit would restore control over its borders. The timing of Emmanuel Macron's visit couldn't be more calculated. As British officials scrambled to finalize what they're euphemistically calling a one-in, one-out arrangement, the French president arrives not as a supplicant seeking favor, but as a power broker holding cards that could make or break Keir Starmer's immigration strategy. The irony is delicious, isn't it? Post-Brexit Britain, having rejected European integration, now finds itself more dependent on French goodwill than ever before. But let's examine what these innovative approaches actually entail, because the devil, as always, lurks in the details. French authorities have completed a legal review examining how police might intercept boats already at sea, a practice previously forbidden under maritime law. The proposed methods read like something from a particularly grim episode of Border Force. Jet skis equipped with nets designed to ensnare propellers, forcing overcrowded dinghies to halt mid-channel. It's tactically ingenious and morally questionable in equal measure. The brutal mathematics of deterrence theory suggests that increasing the probability of interception while simultaneously raising the stakes of failure should, theoretically, reduce attempted crossings. Yet history teaches us that desperate people make desperate choices regardless of odds. The question Britain must confront isn't whether these methods will work. It's whether a civilized nation can live with the consequences when they inevitably go wrong. Consider the one-in, one-out proposal currently under negotiation. On paper, it appears elegantly simple. For every asylum seeker who successfully reaches British shores via small boat and gets returned to France, Britain accepts one refugee from French camps deemed to have stronger asylum claims. It's presented as a humanitarian solution, but scratch beneath the surface and you'll find something far more cynical. This isn't generosity. It's a sophisticated form of outsourcing that allows Britain to maintain the fiction of border control, whilst France bears the practical burden of processing asylum claims. British officials speak of lots of moving parts remaining, which is diplomatic code for we haven't figured out how to make this politically palatable to our base whilst legally defensible in court. The numbers tell a story that politicians would rather ignore. Over 20,000 people have crossed the Channel in the first 6 months of this year alone, a 48% increase compared to the same period in 2024. That's not just a statistic, it's a damning indictment of every previous attempt to address this crisis. From Priti Patel's Rwanda scheme to Suella Braverman's inflammatory rhetoric, successive conservative governments threw millions of solutions that achieve precisely nothing except inflaming public sentiment. Now Starmer and Cooper find themselves trapped by their own promises. Having pledged to smash the gangs orchestrating these crossings, they discovered what their predecessors learned the hard way. Dismantling international criminal networks requires more than tough rhetoric and photo opportunities. It demands sustained international cooperation, significant financial investment, and, most uncomfortably for British politicians, accepting that Britain's influence over events has distinct limits. The really fascinating aspect of this crisis isn't the humanitarian dimension, though that remains paramount, but the geopolitical implications. France's willingness to modify its maritime policies represents a dramatic shift in how European nations approach migration management. By essentially militarizing the Channel crossing prevention effort, both countries are crossing lines that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. What's particularly striking is how this arrangement invokes traditional power dynamics. Historically, Britain's island geography provided natural protection, forcing potential migrants to traverse other European nations first. Brexit complicated this arrangement, removing Britain from European burden-sharing mechanisms while simultaneously increasing its dependence on bilateral agreements with individual EU members. France, recognizing this leverage, isn't simply helping Britain solve a humanitarian crisis, it's extracting maximum political and financial advantage from Britain's predicament. Macron's visit this week isn't about friendship or shared values. It's about establishing terms for a relationship where France holds significantly more cards than Britain would care to admit. The proposed jet ski interdiction program illustrates this power imbalance perfectly. French authorities will risk their personnel's safety implementing tactics that British officials design but cannot legally execute themselves. If operations succeed, both governments claim victory. If they result in tragedy, and maritime operations inevitably carry risks, France bears primary responsibility whilst Britain maintains plausible deniability. This arrangement raises profound questions about democratic accountability. British voters elect governments partly based on immigration policies, yet the actual implementation of those policies depends entirely on decisions made in Paris. If French authorities decide tomorrow that these tactics are too risky or politically costly, Britain's entire Channel strategy collapses overnight. The legal complexities surrounding maritime interception deserve particular attention. International law traditionally prohibits interfering with vessels in distress, even when those vessels are engaged in technically illegal activities. The French legal review attempting to navigate these constraints represents a fascinating exercise in creative jurisprudence, finding loopholes that allow aggressive intervention whilst maintaining technical compliance with international obligations. Yet even if these legal gymnastics succeed, operational realities present their own challenges. The Channel represents one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, where weather conditions can deteriorate rapidly and rescue operations require split-second coordination between multiple agencies. Adding aggressive interdiction tactics to this already complex environment significantly increases risks for everyone involved. British officials privately acknowledge these concerns whilst publicly maintaining optimism about cooperation prospects. The phrase, "we want to get it right," that government sources repeatedly uses in confidence, its anxiety barely disguised as caution. They understand that failure won't just embarrass the government, it could fundamentally destabilize Britain's relationship with its most important European partner. The timing pressure surrounding Macron's visit creates additional complications. Diplomatic protocols typically require agreement to be finalized before announcement, yet British sources admit significant details remain unresolved. The temptation to announce progress prematurely, simply to demonstrate momentum, could result in commitments that prove impossible to implement effectively. What makes the situation particularly precarious is how it intersects with broader European migration policies. The European Union's new Migration and Asylum Pact, implemented earlier this year, fundamentally alters how member states process asylum claims and share responsibilities. Britain, as a non-member, must negotiate individual arrangements that don't conflict with France's EU obligations, a diplomatic minefield requiring extraordinary precision. The one-in, one-out mechanism attempts to thread this needle by creating bilateral exchanges that theoretically don't undermine multilateral European frameworks. Yet the practical implementation raises countless questions about eligibility criteria, processing timelines, and appeal procedures that could take months to resolve satisfactorily. Meanwhile, the human cost of delay continues mounting. Every day these negotiations continue, more people risk their lives in overcrowded dinghies, more families are separated by bureaucratic processes, and more resources are diverted from addressing root causes of migration towards managing its symptoms. The criminal networks facilitating these crossings adapt faster than governments can respond. As French authorities develop new interdiction techniques, smugglers modify their operations accordingly. Recent intelligence suggests gangs are already experimenting with alternative departure points and different vessel types specifically designed to evade jet ski interdiction attempts. This creates an escalating dynamic where each new enforcement measure prompts criminal innovation, requiring increasingly sophisticated counter-responses. The logical endpoint of this arms race isn't enhanced border security. It's militarized maritime borders that fundamentally alter the character of European civilization. British public opinion remains sharply divided on these developments. Polling consistently shows majority support for reducing channel crossings, yet the same surveys reveal significant discomfort with aggressive interdiction methods. This contradiction places enormous pressure on politicians to deliver results whilst maintaining moral high ground, a balance that may prove impossible to achieve. Conservative opposition figures, having failed to solve this crisis during 14 years in government, now criticize Labour's approach as simultaneously too aggressive and insufficiently effective. This political opportunism illustrates how immigration issues poison rational policy discussion, making evidence-based solutions nearly impossible to implement. The real tragedy is that workable solutions exist, but they require long-term thinking and international cooperation on scales that electoral cycles rarely accommodate. Addressing root causes of migration, conflict, poverty, climate change demands sustained investment and political commitment that transcends party politics and national boundaries. Instead, we get tactical responses that treat symptoms whilst ignoring underlying causes. French police puncturing dinghies doesn't address why people risk everything to reach Britain. Jet ski interdiction programs don't resolve the economic inequalities that drive migration in the first place. What's particularly frustrating is how this crisis highlights broader failures of post-Brexit Britain to develop coherent international engagement strategies. Having rejected multilateral European frameworks, Britain now discovers that bilateral arrangements are significantly more complex, expensive, and politically fraught than the systems they replaced. The Channel crossing crisis has become a perfect metaphor for Brexit's unintended consequences. Promised sovereignty delivered dependency. Pledged control produced chaos. Guaranteed solutions generated greater problems. The gap between rhetoric and reality has never been more stark or politically damaging. As Macron's visit approaches, both leaders face enormous pressure to demonstrate progress whilst managing expectations about what's actually achievable. The choreography of diplomacy requires optimistic announcements even when underlying realities remain stubbornly unchanged. Whether they succeed in crafting arrangements that prove both effective and sustainable remains to be seen. What's certain is that failure will have consequences extending far beyond immigration policy, potentially destabilizing the entire foundation of post-Brexit Anglo-French relations. The stakes couldn't be higher. Britain's credibility as a serious international partner depends partly on demonstrating capacity to manage its own borders effectively. France's willingness to assist depends on receiving adequate compensation, financial, political, and diplomatic, for shouldering risks that properly belong to Britain. This dynamic creates perverse incentives where both nations might prioritize short-term political advantage over long-term strategic cooperation. The temptation to declare victory prematurely, blame partners when problems arise, or abandon commitments when political winds shift could sabotage arrangements before they have opportunity to succeed. Yet the alternative, continued crisis management without strategic resolution, offers even less attractive prospects. The current trajectory leads inevitably toward further militarization of border enforcement, increased human suffering, and deeper political instability across Europe. The choices facing both governments are stark, and the margins of error virtually non-existent. What unfolds over the next few days will echo through British and French politics for years to come, potentially determining whether post-Brexit Britain can forge functional relationships with European partners or remain perpetually dependent on arrangements it cannot control. The Channel crisis represents more than immigration policy. It's a test of whether democratic nations can address complex challenges requiring international cooperation whilst maintaining domestic political legitimacy. The early signs are not encouraging, but the consequences of failure are too significant to contemplate. Make sure you're subscribed to UK Connors because this story is far from over, and the developments coming out of Macron's visit will reshape British politics in ways we're only beginning to understand. The future of Britain's relationship with Europe, and perhaps the very nature of British sovereignty, hangs in the balance. We'll be watching every move analyzing every statement, and bringing you the insights that mainstream media won't dare discuss. Don't miss what happens next.